The small Yorkshire town of Howden, nestling aside of the River Ouse, famed for its 13th century minster. So how did this small Yorkshire town become famous for building the best airship England ever built? It was in the early 1920s that Vickers proposed a scheme to build 6 giant rigid airships to fly to the 4 corners of the empire to prove that Britannia not only ruled the waves, but the skyways as well. So why not use aeroplanes like this 1935 Dragon Rapide? Well, aeroplanes at the time were short-range affairs, hadn't got the range or payload of an airship, so airships were the way forward. And so began the Imperial airship scheme, 2 ships to the same specification built by opposing teams, one a government-led team, the other a private sector team. The ship to be built by the government was designated the R-101. She was to be built in this shed at Cardington in Bedfordshire, at the Royal Airship Works. Only one other place had an airship shed that was long enough to build a 700-foot long airship, and that was at the old Royal Naval Airship Station at Howden in Yorkshire, with its twin 750-foot long No. 2 shed. The R-100 was designed by none other than the great Barnes Wallis, famed later on for his work on the geodetic structure of the Wellington bomber, and of course the bouncing bomb. He was ably assisted by Neville Shute Norway, later to be known better as the novelist Neville Shute, who was to write many fine novels, including his autobiography Slide Rule, that has a fine account of the R-100. Construction commenced in the sheds at Howden in 1926. First of all, the transverse rings were made on the floor of the shed. These were hung vertically from the roof and connected with longitudinal members. The bays formed between 2 rings were filled with a gas cell. These were made of a light fabric lined with gold beater skin, made from part of the large intestines of cattle. 50,000 such skins were needed for a large gas cell. The gas cell was then held in place with a mesh netting. Over the top of this went the outer cover, which was made from a strong linen fabric. The 16th of December 1929, the prototype R-100 was ready, and she was taken out of a shed for the first and only time. Hundreds of soldiers had been drafted in from York to manhandle the ship out of a shed. Gracefully she took to the air and headed for Howden. The R-100's maiden flight started with no drama. The controls worked well as she circled over Howden and flew north to York, circled York Minster, and then turned and headed south for Cardington, her new home in Bedfordshire. On arrival at Cardington, the R-100 was moored to Cardington's mast, the only one in the UK. The mooring mast was more than just an anchor point. Supplies could be brought up and fed through the nose of the ship. Passengers could also enter through the nose of the ship and follow a corridor down behind these windows to the passenger's cell. Here on 3 levels was the accommodation. The upper 2 levels were meant for the passengers, with a large dining room and 2 and 4 berth cabins, the lower area for the crew. To power a giant airship of 720 feet in length, you needed engines, powerful engines, 6 in all, Rolls-Royce Condors, each of 675 horsepower. Here we see a Rolls-Royce Eagle, which was a much smaller engine, but very similar to the Condor. The next day the R-100 made another successful 6.5-hour test flight. No major problems were found. With the success of the initial flight trials, the R-100 was put into a new shed at Cardington. Between January and May 1930, the R-100 notched up 100 flying hours. The test flying actually showed up very few faults, though there was a little bit of trouble when the tail fractured in May. The ship was repaired, but had a blunter tail. She then went on a 24-hour test flight over the Midlands in preparation and shakedown for a trip to Canada, which up until she was travelling down the St. Lawrence River was pretty uneventful, when a major patch of turbulence tore holes in the fins, one large enough to drive a bus through. The ship was patched up in situ and went on to Montreal and a rapturous reception. 100,000 people came to see the R-100 at the Montreal mast. In the 12 days she was there, they even wrote a song about the gallant R-100. But soon it was time to return to England. After nearly 58 hours in the air, the R-100 docked to the mast at Cardington. She was put in a shed and repairs were put in hand. After the success of the R-100's return trip to Canada, it was then the turn of the R-101 to prove she was as airworthy as her sister, but she'd only just had major modifications and she leaked badly. She slipped the mast on October the 4th, 1930. She was never to return again. In the early hours of October the 5th, the R-101 hit a French hillside. She burst into flames and 46 people were killed in the ensuing fire. 2 more were to die of their injuries within a couple of days. Only 6 people survived. The dead were brought back to Cardington and are buried here in this small churchyard opposite St Mary's Church, in sight of the giant airship sheds where they built the R-101. As for the R-100, she lay in a shed until she was deflated in December that year. Her fate unknown. However, she was to leave the shed only one more time. In November 1931, she was taken apart and left the shed as £450 worth of scrap metal. And so ended the Imperial airship scheme. So what remains of the Imperial airship programme today? Well, the sheds are still there large as life at Cardington, though shed 1 is in need of repair. Most of the station has now been demolished. These sheds were probably the ones at the base of the Cardington mast, though we can't be sure. As for R.N.A.S Howden, the sheds were taken down in the mid-30s, and is now farmland and a golf course. Further up the road from Howden, in Elvington, is the Yorkshire Air Museum, which is well worth a visit. They have displays on the building of the R-100, and also have a piece of the actual ship, which is one of the joints between the transverse frames and the longitudinal members, which looks remarkably new. And also, you might see a familiar model there. That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid, for this time. So until next time, we'll see you then.